We all keep family secrets, but some are buried so deep they're at the roots of everything we are. When I opened the attic after my grandfather's funeral, I thought I was stepping into grief. What I found instead was a sealed box of letters that shattered everything I believed about my bloodline. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a confrontation with a legacy we were never meant to inherit. If you ever wonder how much truth your family can survive, don't look away. It started with the way the dust hung in the air like a shroud, golden in the shaft of afternoon sunlight that cut through the attic window, slow-moving and sacred, almost like it understood the weight of the moment better than I did. I hadn't stepped into that space since I was a child, not since Grandpa used to bring me up there to show me things that he claimed held stories too heavy for the house below. But this time he wasn't with me, and the house felt different. Empty not just of his body, which lay buried only 3 days earlier, but empty of his voice, his strange humor, his carefully measured silences. I could still hear my mother crying downstairs, her voice muffled and raw through the wooden floors. And though I wanted to go to her, I needed this space, this quiet, this sense of being closer to him. The attic was unchanged, old chests, cobweb corners, peeling wallpaper that once depicted faint floral patterns now faded into ghostly outlines. But there was something different in the air, a sense that something had been left behind, deliberately. Greed has a way of making you cling to the tangible. The worn flannel shirt still draped over a nailed peg, the scent of tobacco and varnish that lingered in the floorboards, the creak of his rocking chair still echoing in my head. I found the box purely by accident, or maybe it was always meant to find me, wedged between two beams, behind an old oil painting of a horse-drawn carriage that I'd always thought was ugly. The box wasn't dusty, which immediately struck me as odd. Everything else in the attic looked like it had been swallowed by time. But this box looked as though it had been set there just yesterday. I hesitated, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for it, almost as if part of me knew this moment would change everything. It was wooden, dark mahogany with metal hinges, and surprisingly light. No lock, no label, just weight, not the physical kind, but the emotional kind that seeps into your chest and curls there like a cold stone. Inside were letters, stacks of them, tied together in neat bundles with twine. The paper yellow but not brittle, the ink faded but still legible. At first, I didn't read them. I just stared. I don't know how long I sat in that attic, cross-legged on the warped floorboards, with the box open and the smell of old paper rising like incense. I kept thinking about his funeral, about how quiet it was, how few people came. He was a good man, or so I thought. A quiet man who built model ships and read the newspaper front to back every morning, who whistled when he gardened and used to slip me butterscotch candies when my mom wasn't looking. But he also had that room in the basement he never let anyone into. He also had nights when he wouldn't speak at all, when he'd just sit on the porch staring into dark, his eyes far away, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. These letters, whatever they contained, they suddenly felt like keys to a house I never knew we lived in. I picked the top one. The handwriting was unmistakable. His, elegant, slanted, precise. The envelope was addressed not to a person, but to a date, July 17th, 1972. It was as though he had written to a moment in time, not someone. I opened it, the paper soft but strong beneath my fingers. My eyes scanned the first few lines, and instantly my breath caught. I never meant for it to happen, but once it did, I couldn't turn back. There was no greeting, no name, just that sentence, hanging like a noose. The rest of the letter went on to describe a summer I had never heard him talk about, of a woman named Elena, of a fire in a barn, of a decision made in panic and never spoken of again. I read it twice before setting it down, my heart pounding so hard I could feel in my throat. Who was Elena? What fire? What decision? I looked through the other envelopes. None had names, only dates, and they weren't spaced evenly. Some months had 3 or 4 letters. Others had none. But one thing was clear, this wasn't a diary. These were confessions. I didn't tell anyone about the letters. I didn't tell my mother or my brother or the man from the funeral home who kept calling about the estate. I spent every spare moment in that attic, reading by the gray light of a dusty bulb. Sometimes staying up so late, I'd fall asleep curled against the boxes, waking with paper creases on my cheek and the echo of my grandfather's words in my mind. Every letter chipped away at the man I thought I knew. He wrote about things I couldn't reconcile, moments of violence, of fear, of mistakes that rippled forward in time. Some letters were brief, almost cryptic. Others were long, rambling, as though he were trying to explain himself to someone who would never read them. I started to feel like I was the wrong person for these secrets, like they'd been meant for someone braver, someone wiser. But I also couldn't stop. There was one line that haunted me for days. They don't know what we did. Not really. And if they ever found out, it would end everything. The more I read, the more I began to notice patterns, names that came up again and again, places I didn't recognize, phrases that sounded like code. I started making notes, mapping out connections like some desperate archaeologist excavating a family I never knew existed. I began to question everything. How much did my mother know? Had she found the letters and buried them again? Was my grandfather trying to confess or to warn me? And worst of all, what if I wasn't who I thought I was? What if our whole bloodline, our name, our legacy, was built on something so dark it had to be buried under wood and dust and decades of silence? I hadn't cried at the funeral. I'd stood there, stiff and numb, watching the casket lower like it was someone else's life. But now, reading those letters, I wept. Not because he was gone, but because I wasn't sure if he had ever really been here at all. Not in the way I believed. The smell of dust became a comfort and a curse. Every time I opened the attic door, I felt like I was breathing in his secrets. And I hadn't even reached the worst of them yet. That much I could feel, pulsing beneath the ink, waiting to break me that I began to lose track of time up there, in that suffocating attic where the air always seemed on the verge of whispering something terrible, something long buried and desperate to be heard, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for decades and I had just triggered the exhale. My phone buzzed with missed calls, unopened texts, reminders of a world still moving outside the brittle pages I couldn't tear myself away from, but none of it mattered. Because every letter I read stitched a new, darker thread into the fabric of my family, and I couldn't stop myself from pulling at those threads, even as I felt the whole thing begin to unravel in my hands. The second bundle of letters was tied with a different color string, red, faded almost pink, and stained at one corner with something I told myself was just tea or old ink, though the part of me that was still sane and grounded knew better. These letters were different, not confessions, not entirely. They were conversations, half-finished arguments, reflections that felt like they were meant for someone specific, someone my grandfather once loved or feared or owed something to. They weren't addressed at anyone in particular, but the tone shifted, less matter-of-fact, more haunted. There were passages I had to reread 3 or 4 times just to wrap my mind around the implications. You said we had no choice, one letter read, but you didn't have to watch her choke. You didn't have to bury her like that. I dropped the paper. My hand shook. The attic light flickered. I told myself it was a bulb going bad, but the tremble in my spine knew better. That letter, the fourth in the red string bundle, was dated August 1972, just a few weeks after first. The timeline was building itself like a puzzle I never asked to solve, each new letter another jagged piece. Who was her? Who was you? Was my grandfather writing to an accomplice, or to himself, haunted by the echo of what he'd done? The next few days became a blur. I stopped eating regular meals. I only spoke to my mother in short, distracted fragments, enough to keep her from worrying too much, though I could see the concern growing behind her eyes. She kept asking if I was all right, if I was sleeping, if I needed to talk about Grandpa. I lied, because what else could I do? How do you tell someone that the man who used to tie your shoes and carry you on his shoulders also buried a woman in secret and wrote letters to ghosts? One letter, dated September 9th, 1972, was particularly long and almost unreadable, the ink smudged and bleeding in places, as if written with a shaking hand or in the middle of a storm. It spoke of a cabin, no location given, just the place where the scream stopped as a description, which sent a deep, cold throb through my chest. He mentioned a boy, not me, not my brother, someone unnamed. He wasn't supposed to be there, Grandpa wrote. But once he saw what we did, we had no choice. My stomach turned. Was this boy killed? Hidden? Threatened into silence? I began digging through old family photos, looking for any unfamiliar faces, anything out of place. Nothing. Every picture looked painfully normal. Birthday parties, fishing trips, the usual forced smiles and fading colors. But now every smile looked sinister, every shadow a possible grave. I even found an old yearbook from my grandfather's high school days. He looked the same, older only in the eyes, which carried that unmistakable weariness I now recognized as guilt. I tried searching online for records from that time, news clippings, obituaries, anything that might corroborate what I was reading, but came up empty. It was as if whatever had happened had been scrubbed clean, buried not just by time but by effort. He had wanted this forgotten, and yet he wrote it all down. Why? Why write letters if he intended for no one to find them? Or was I the intended reader all along? That thought chilled me more than anything else. One morning, I woke up on the attic floor with a cramp in my neck and a blanket draped over me. I hadn't brought one up. My mother must have found me and covered me in the night, and the idea of her seeing the letters, even just one, filled me with a sudden, irrational panic. I began hiding them after every session, tucking them deep into a false-bottom drawer in the attic desk, locking the attic door behind me even though we'd never locked it before. It wasn't just about protecting Grandpa's secrets anymore. It was about protecting myself from what I might do with the knowledge, from what it might make me. I started dreaming in fragments of his words. Burning barns, choking breaths, a boy crying out in the dark, and always the same ending, silence and a shovel. The emotional toll was starting to show. My hands trembled when I held a pen. I snapped at my brother over nothing. I began checking behind doors and under my bed like a child, not out of fear of monsters, but out of fear of reality. The letters were revealing a version of my grandfather that felt incompatible with the man I had known, a man who taught me how to whittle birds out of wood, who once cried when my childhood dog died. Could that man also be the author of these brutal memories? I didn't want to believe it, but denial was growing harder with each envelope I opened. And yet, beneath the horror, there was something else I couldn't ignore. Pain. These weren't the writings of a psychopath. They were the writings of a man drowning in the weight of what he had done, unable to let go but unable to confess. There were moments, brief, flickering, where his voice cracked through the page, raw and human. "I see her in my dreams," he wrote in October 1972. "Not the way she died. The way she smiled when I first met her. That's the version I want to remember. But I don't deserve it." I wept reading that one. I wept for him and for her, and for the entire tangle of shame and love and destruction that bled through those pages. And somewhere in that emotional wreckage, I began to see a deeper horror than just murder or betrayal. The horror of becoming your sins, of letting them shape you until there's nothing left but the shadow they cast. I didn't know it yet, but I was already standing at the edge of something far darker than anything I could have imagined, something that would not only destroy my image of my grandfather, but tear apart the very fabric of who we were as a family. And I was still only halfway through the letters. There's something deeply destabilizing about realizing the person you loved most was a stranger by design, like walking through a house you thought you knew only to discover hidden doors and entire rooms you were never invited into, and in those rooms lived memories that throbbed with the darkness, so personal it felt obscene just to witness them. Yet I kept opening those doors, kept reading, because once you catch the scent of the truth, even a rotten one, it infects you, and you begin to need it more than food, more than sleep, more than safety, and that's exactly what happened to me in the days that followed my deep dive into the second bundle of my grandfather's letters. I stopped thinking of him as Grandpa, the warm man who taught me chess and tucked me in with bedtime stories, and started seeing him as two people coexisting within the same body. The man I had known and the man who had written these letters, and the more I read, the more the second man began to feel like the real one. One morning, I found myself pacing the attic floor, before even opening a letter, anxious and twitching like an addict, already anticipating the emotional drop that would come with the next revelation. And when I finally selected a letter from November 1972, I knew I was holding something dangerous even before my eyes began to scan the lines. The letter was longer than most, nearly 10 pages, written in cramped, hurried script that veered from elegant cursive to jittery slashes, as if he'd been wrestling with himself while writing, and began with a sentence that chilled me to my bones. He called me by my name before I ever told it to him. I stopped reading, my breath caught, because the sentence felt like a code, like a moment out of place with the rest of the narrative, as if someone else had entered the story, someone whose presence threatened the already fragile line between truth and delusion. He went on to describe a night spent in the woods, a drive he hadn't planned, a voice that led him there, not a supernatural voice, nothing ghostly, just a memory speaking with new clarity, guiding him towards something he buried not in the ground but in his conscience. That night, he wrote, he walked back to the cabin alone and found a photo pinned to the door, one he hadn't seen since 1968. The photo, he said, was of a little girl. Her name was not included, but he recognized her. She smiled with her front tooth missing and held a red ribbon in her hand, he wrote. The same ribbon we left at the site. The way he referred to we became increasingly disorienting. It was always we, but never clarified. No partner was ever named, no accomplice acknowledged, and that ambiguity began to fester in my mind until I started to believe the partner had never existed, that maybe my grandfather had split himself into two in his mind to survive the weight of what he'd done, using the plural like a shield against the singular horror of sole responsibility. The more I read, the more it seemed likely. He wrote in loops, often revisiting the same event from different emotional angles. The barn fire, the choking girl, the boy in the cabin, the red ribbon. Each event circled back to the others like a constellation whose shape only made sense when seen from a distance, and yet I couldn't find the distance. I was in too deep. I began to write in a journal of my own, not to make sense of it, but to survive it. My entries were chaotic. Pages of scribbled questions, names, timelines, emotional outbursts, some written with shaking hands in the middle of the night after dreaming of burning walls and screams that didn't end. I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. My skin paled, my eyes looked bruised, and there was always a slight twitch in the corner of my mouth, as though part of me had begun to rot from the inside. I tried, once, to talk to my mother again, casually, carefully. I asked her if she ever remembered Grandpa mentioning a girl named Elena or a cabin out in the woods. She gave me a strange look, guarded, then said no, not that she could recall, and asked why I was so interested. I lied. I said I was trying to write a story, a fictional one, about a man uncovering his grandfather's past. Her eyes softened, but only slightly. That sounds sad, she said. Try not to make him a monster. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because I didn't know if he was a monster or a man who had drowned in his own guilt, and I didn't know which would be worse. The next letter I read was dated December 1972, Christmas Eve, and it was the most emotionally raw of them all. In it, Grandpa described sitting at his desk with a bottle of something strong, listening to the radio crackle with distant carols, and writing as a means to stay sane. He mentioned hearing footsteps outside the house, though he lived alone then. He mentioned seeing a shadow cross the kitchen window. Maybe it's her, he wrote. Maybe she's come to take me down with her. Then, in the next paragraph, he corrected himself. No, she's not coming. She's never coming. That's the curse, isn't it? Not the punishment, but the waiting for one that never arrives. I read that sentence over and over again until it echoed inside my skull. The curse wasn't the act. The curse was surviving it, living with it. I began to feel the weight of that curse myself. My dreams turned more vivid, more visceral. I began seeing her, this girl with the missing tooth and red ribbon, in flashes when I closed my eyes. Not a ghost, just a presence carved into my mind by my grandfather's words. I didn't tell anyone about these visions. I didn't tell anyone that I began avoiding mirrors in the dark, or that I sometimes walked out into the yard late at night, barefoot, just to stand on the sky and feel something bigger than the weight I carried. I became convinced that the story wasn't just his anymore. It was mine too. In reading his words, I had inherited his guilt, his burden. The letters weren't just memories. They were invitations, contracts written in ink that somehow seeped into my bloodstream. I didn't know where this path was leading, but I was sure of one thing. The man who had raised me, who had held my hand crossing streets and whispered bedtime stories, was a fabrication, a carefully curated illusion designed to hide a history soaked in silence. And I wasn't just uncovering that history. I was becoming a part of it. I didn't plan on searching the shed that morning. It was one of those gray, half-awake days where the sky looked like wet paper and the silence in the house was too loud to ignore. But something had shifted in me after that last letter. Something tight and panicked, like the feeling of having forgotten something terribly important. And as I wandered outside under the guise of needing fresh air, my feet pulled me not toward the road or the swing where I used to sit as a child, but toward the old tool shed at the back of the property, half swallowed by ivy and time, its roof sagging and one door forever stuck on rusted hinges. And as I stood there with my hand on the warp handle, I realized I hadn't stepped inside it in over a decade. It was a forgotten place, dismissed as a storage graveyard for rusted tools and paint cans. But now, after weeks spent crawling through the past, it felt like the kind of place that would hide things too dangerous for the attic, too physical to be confessed on paper. The door resisted, groaning like something protesting the exposure of secrets. And when I finally pushed through, the smell hit me first. Old oil, mildew would rot, and something else, something faintly sour that curled in my stomach before I could place it. Dust swirled in the slanted light, and for a moment I just stood there, breath shallow, waiting for something, anything, to jump out at me, but nothing did. The shed was exactly what I remembered, cluttered, dim, suffocating. But then I saw it, leaning behind an overturned workbench, partly covered by a moldy tarp, an old portrait frame, cracked and heavy, its back to me as if trying to remain hidden. I don't know why I reached for it. Maybe some part of me already knew it didn't belong there, that it had been put there with intention. My fingers trembled as I pulled it forward. Flakes of rotted wood falling away like ash, and when I turned it over, I nearly dropped it. It was a photograph, large and formal, like the kind families used to have professionally taken and framed with care, but I didn't recognize a single face in it. 4 people. 2 adults, 2 children. None of them were my mother, my grandfather, or anyone I could name. The man in the photo looked older, tall and lean, with sunken eyes and a rigid posture. The woman stood beside him, unsmiling, her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a little girl. And then there was the boy. Something about him made my breath catch, not because he looked familiar, but because he didn't. His eyes, dark and wide, looked directly into the camera, almost into me, with an expression that felt entirely wrong for a child. Not fear, not sadness, just emptiness. The back of the photo had something scribbled in pencil, almost illegible under layers of grime. Summer 1964, the last one before everything changed. I took the photo inside, wrapped in a towel like it was something fragile and sacred, and laid it on the dining room table, staring at it for hours while my mind spun with possibilities. Who were these people? Why had Grandpa kept this photo hidden away, separate from all the albums and frames that lined the hallway? And why was it labeled like a warning rather than a memory? I began comparing the image with names and events mentioned in the letters, but there were no direct matches, only allusions. The girl who smiled with the red ribbon, the boy who watched from the trees, the night the house fell silent. Were these the people from the cabin? Was this the family he wrote about? It didn't make sense, and yet it made too much sense, in that terrible way where your gut knows what your brain refuses to confirm. Later that evening, I brought the photo to my mother. I didn't say anything at first, just placed it in front of her while she was folding laundry, and when she looked down, her hands froze. For a long moment she didn't speak, just stared, her face draining of color. Then she whispered, "Where did you find this?" Her voice was so low, I almost didn't hear it. I told her, the shed, the tarp, the dust, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were not just confused, they were afraid. "That's not ours," she said finally, pushing the photo away as though it burned. I've never seen it before. But she was lying. I could see in the way her fingers trembled, in the way she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom," I said, softly but firmly, "please." She stood up without another word, left the room, and didn't speak to me again for the rest of the night. I felt something cold settle inside me then, a realization I'd been circling for weeks but hadn't dared to articulate. I wasn't just uncovering my grandfather's secrets. I was uncovering our family's entire buried foundation. The silence, the missing years, the strange way my mother reacted to certain questions. None of it was accidental. These weren't isolated memories or lapses in detail. They were omissions. I went back to the letters with renewed desperation, combing them for anything, names, towns, landmarks, that could connect a photo to a place, a time, a story. And eventually I found it. A brief mention in a letter dated January 1973. She took the photo down after the funeral, said it didn't feel right to keep it on the wall anymore. I told her it was dangerous to throw it out, that it had to be kept, just not where anyone would see it. So I put with the tools. That's where it belongs now. Among the things we used to build and bury. That was it. No names, no details, just a quiet, damning confirmation that the photo mattered, that it was evidence of something unspoken and unforgivable. I printed copies and pinned them to my wall, alongside pages of notes and quotes from the letters. My room became a map of pain, a shrine to a history no one wanted remembered. I no longer knew what I was looking for, truth maybe or atonement, but I knew I was getting closer, and with each new discovery, I felt my grip on the present loosen. My mother avoided me. My brother stopped returning my calls. I barely noticed. I was living in two timelines now, mine and my grandfather's, and the two were starting to blur. I began to dream in sepia, the colors of old film reels, of wooden frames and shed walls and little boys with hollow eyes. And always, in those dreams, the photo would be there, propped against a tree or floating in water, watching me, waiting. I no longer wondered if I should stop. That choice had disappeared the moment I touched the first letter. The only way forward now was through, and I had no idea what I was about to find in the next letter. Only that would bring everything I thought I knew crashing down. I didn't choose a fifth letter with intention. It wasn't marked differently, wasn't set apart in any meaningful way, but something about it felt weighted, like the envelope itself carried more than just words, and I remember hesitating before opening it, sitting at the attic desk with a photo from the shed still propped beside me, its unfamiliar faces now burned into my memory like the image of a scar you can't unsee, and as I slid my finger beneath the brittle flap, a sliver of dread crept through me. Not the kind that warned of ghosts or monsters, but the quiet, suffocating kind that whispered you're about to know something you can never unknow. The letter was dated February 4th, 1973, written in ink that had begun to fade at the edges, and right away I noticed a difference in tone. This one wasn't reflective or guilt-ridden or encoded in metaphor. It was direct, urgent. The first line read, "You were never supposed to exist." I dropped the paper. My mouth went dry. When I picked it back up, my eyes blurred from the tremble in my hands, and I read on, desperate and terrified. The night we left the cabin, we thought it was over. We thought what we buried would stay buried. But she came back. Not to haunt us. Nothing so dramatic. She came back pregnant. The world tilted. I kept reading, the attic closing on me with every word. She never told me directly. I heard it from her sister, who said she was living in a trailer park outside Marlow County, working nights at a diner, and trying to pretend she still had a future. I didn't go to her. I told myself it was mercy. But really I was afraid. Afraid of what she'd say. Afraid the child was mine. The next line hit harder than anything that came before it. If it was, then everything I've done since has been a lie. My thoughts spiraled. Every memory with my grandfather suddenly tainted by this revelation. A child, a hidden child, a life erased before it could begin. I stood, dizzy, walked in circles, tried to breathe. My chest burned. I went back to the letter. I told your mother once. Just once. She said she didn't want to know. Said it was better that way. So we kept the silence. But silence doesn't erase blood. It only makes it louder. My heart thundered in my ears. The implications crashed into me like waves I couldn't hold back. Was he saying I wasn't who I thought I was? That someone out there shared my blood and had no idea? That maybe everything, our family name, our home, our legacy, was built on a foundation of omission and cowardice? He went on, I saw him once from a distance. He was maybe 5, sitting on the steps outside that diner, holding a paper cup and watching cars go by like he was waiting for someone who never came. I told myself it wasn't him, that it could have been any boy. But I knew. I've lived with that image ever since. I couldn't sit down. I couldn't stay still. I felt a scream build in my throat, but didn't let it out. The next page was torn, either by time or intention. I couldn't tell, but what remained hit harder than anything that had come before it. I named him in my head. Samuel. He looked like one. I don't know if she gave him that name. I never asked, but it felt right and wrong, because no one should name what they abandoned. That was the moment I cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like porcelain under pressure. A slow fracture. A loss of identity so subtle it felt like watching my own reflection fade. Who was Samuel? Where was he now? Did he know? Did he wonder about the man who never showed up? I suddenly felt the crushing weight of all the choices that had been made before I was ever born. Choices that rippled forward in time like cracks through glass. And worst of all, I realized the truth might go even deeper. I remembered the photo. The boy. The hollow eyes. Could that have been him? Could the portrait in the shed have captured a family that was erased to preserve ours? I confronted my mother again, this time without hesitation. I held the letter in my hand, shaking, and demanded answers. She didn't deny it. She didn't even pretend to be confused. She just looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in weeks, and said, "I told him we should have burned them." Her voice was flat, dead. They weren't for you. That night, I sat alone in the attic and reread every line of that letter over and over until I memorized the pain. It became part of me. I didn't know what I was going to do. Find him, maybe, or try to, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The family I thought I came from was a lie. My grandfather had built a wall of silence to protect us, but all it did was trap us in a house of ghosts made of real people, real pain, real decisions no one wanted to own. And now I had inherited it, not by choice, but by blood, by truth. And the only way forward was to keep digging, keep reading, no matter how deep the rot when I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't have I tried? My mind raced with names and places, and a growing compulsion to untangle the knot that had been handed to me like a family heirloom made of barbed wire. And by dawn I was hunched over the kitchen table with a legal pad, 3 open laptops, the 5th letter laid out in front of me, and the photo from the shed propped beside a lukewarm cup of coffee I kept. Forgetting to drink, and though I didn't have much to go on, just a vague mention of a diner in Marlowe County, the year 1973, and a name my grandfather had only imagined, I began tracing every possible lead, every diner that had existed within a 50-mile radius of the area back then, using digitized archives, defunct business listings, scanned phone books from libraries I had access through interloan requests, and soon, slowly, a pattern began to emerge, not a clear one, but enough to give me the shape of a life that had once existed in the margins of ours. I found an article from a small-town paper dated June 1973 about a woman named Elena Marsh who had been arrested for disorderly conduct at a roadside diner called Cray's Stop, a place that no longer existed but had once at the junction of Route 41 and Blaker Road. And when I saw the name Elena, my heart stuttered, because that was a name from the first letter, the woman who had come back pregnant. The woman who disappeared into silence while my grandfather rebuilt his life on top of her. Erasure. The article mentioned she had a child with her at the time, a boy, unnamed, and something inside me cracked. This wasn't fiction. This wasn't metaphor. This was history, and I was standing at the edge of a grave with a shovel made of digital fragments and emotional desperation. I printed the article and pinned it to the wall in my bedroom beside the photograph and a copy of the letter, drawing red thread between them like the obsessive detectives you see in movies. Except there was no crime to solve, just lineage, just blood, just the unbearable truth that part of my family tree had been cut off and buried. I tried searching for a Samuel Marsh or any child born to an Elena Marsh between 1967 and 1973 in that region, but the records were either sealed or missing, and with every dead end my frustration grew into something toxic. Because if he was out there, if Samuel existed, then he had been robbed of everything I had taken for granted. Family photos, Christmas mornings, a name free of shame. I found myself staring at the portrait from the shed more and more, studying the boy's face, wondering if he had ever grown into the eyes that looked so hollow in the image, if he ever knew who he was, or worse, if he suspected but never had proof. I began calling local historical societies under the pretense of writing a book, asking about any records related to Elena Marsh or Cray's Stop, and while most were polite, feared anything useful, until one call, with a weary-sounding archivist in her 60s who said, "Elena, that name rings a bell. Pretty girl, if I remember right. Had a rough time of it. Think she left town in the mid-70s. Some said she was running from something." My heart pounded. I asked if anyone remembered the child. There was a pause. Then, might have had a son. Quiet boy. Don't think he stayed in school long. That was all. But it was enough. I spent the next week pulling together fragments of public records, utility bills, old P.O. box numbers, even voter registrations. And though it felt like chasing a shadow, I finally landed on something concrete. A death certificate. Elena Marsh. Died 1981. Cause, vehicular accident. Location, Cleveland, Ohio. No mention of family. No next of kin listed. But she had lived. She had kept going, for a while. And if she had a son, he would have been around 10 when she died. My stomach turned with the weight of it. A boy raised alone. A boy whose mother had died without ever getting justice or acknowledgement or so much as an apology. I imagined Samuel, if that was even his name, bouncing through foster homes or drifting between relatives who didn't want him, all while the other half of his bloodline played house in warm kitchens and held birthday parties and smiled in photographs with no idea they were smiling atop someone else's grave. I confronted my mother again, this time with the article and the death certificate, laid them in front of her without a word. She stared at them for a long time, then quietly said, "I was 17 when he told me. What was I supposed to do?" Her voice cracked, but I didn't answer. I couldn't, because I was no longer sure where blame ended and grief began. That night, I wrote a letter of my own, to Samuel, to the boy who might be my uncle, or my brother, or my cousin. I didn't know. I didn't know anything, except that he had a right to know, and I had an obligation to try. I didn't send it. I just left it on my desk, beneath the 5th letter, like an offering. Like a torch I didn't know how to carry forward. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find next, or if I could even keep going. But something inside me, the part of me that had been set in motion by my grandfather's first confession, knew this story wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And whatever truth lay at the end of it, I had already sacrificed too much to turn back. Now, it wasn't just a truth that hurt. It was a silence, the long, deliberate quiet that had wrapped around it like ivy choking the life out of something once vibrant. And the more I learned, the more that silence screamed through every memory I had of my childhood, of my family, of the man who had quietly governed our lineage like conductor guiding a symphony only he could hear. And now I realized we had all been playing along without knowing the melody was composed in grief and fear and shame, the letters that started the unraveling. But it was a silence, the generational, complicit, careful silence that had allowed the rot to spread, and I couldn't ignore it anymore, not in myself, not in my mother, not in the legacy we had inherited, like a curse dressed in civility. My mother had stopped looking me in the eye, had begun moving to the house like a ghost, doing chores that didn't need doing, folding already folded towels, rewashing dishes that were clean, and when I tried to speak to her, really speak, she would either retreat into silence or deflect with fragile, brittle normalcy. "Did you remember to take your coat to the cleaner?" Or, "We're out of cinnamon again," as if those words could patch over decades of lies. I couldn't blame her, not fully. She was 17 when she was told. 17. Already burdened with the impossible weight of father. She adored turning into a stranger with one sentence. What choice did she have? What tools was she given confronted? And what kind of daughter would she have been if she'd challenged him? These were the questions I began asking myself, over and over, as I spiraled deeper into the emotional fallout of what I now understood to be an inherited silence, a legacy of not speaking, of swallowing trauma whole and smiling to the taste of blood. I found myself wondering how much of that silence I'd already passed on unknowingly, how many moments I had bitten my tongue instead of speaking, how many truths I had buried for the sake of keeping peace, and whether that instinct was mine or planted in me long before I could choose otherwise. The realization that I was becoming a product of that same silence shook me, and I began to keep notes, journal entries about what wasn't said. Every time my mother dodged a question, every time my brother changed the subject, every time I found myself retreating into my own head rather than face the rawness of what I now knew, I started dreaming of Elena, not as a ghost, but as a voice, calm and tired, whispering things I couldn't quite hear. And in those dreams, I always saw a boy standing behind her, older now, eyes hard, watching me with the same quiet indictment that had first struck me in the portrait. I started to believe that even if I found him, even if I traced him to the cracked bones of public records and hidden testimonies, it wouldn't matter. The damage was done. He had grown up without us, without knowledge, without family, and nothing I could say would undo that absence. I realized then that silence isn't just something you live with. It's something you pass down, something you bleed into those around you without even realizing. I confronted my mother one last time, not with anger, but with grief. I showed her the full timeline I'd built, the folder of documents, the map of names and connections, the journal entries, the letter I'd written but not sent, and I told her that I couldn't carry this alone anymore, that we were either going to face it together or it would destroy me from the inside out. She cried, not the polite, restrained crying she allowed herself at funerals, but the ugly, full-body kind that leave you breathless. And when she finally spoke, all she said was, "He made me promise I wouldn't tell." And then he died. And I didn't know who I was without that promise. That sentence wrecked me more than anything else, because it wasn't just her silence. It was the identity she had built around it, the years she had lived with that weight, and the part of her that didn't know how to live without it. I saw myself in her, saw my future if I didn't break the cycle. I started calling family members, asking questions under guise of genealogy, anything to glean new pieces of the puzzle. Most didn't know anything. Some pretended they didn't. One aunt, distant and sharp-tongued, said, "Your grandfather was a complicated man. Leave it at that." But I couldn't, because that sentence, "he was complicated," was just another way of defending silence, of refusing to confront the cost of someone else's choices. I began writing a long-form record of everything, a document not meant to be published or shared, but archived, so the truth, at least in part, would no longer be hidden. I called it The Bloodline We Carry, and it grew into hundreds of pages of letters, transcripts, analysis, memories, photographs, a tapestry of voices both present and absent, all bound together by the through line of what was never said. I didn't know what I hoped to achieve with it, only that it felt necessary, like exhaling after a lifetime of holding my breath. But even with all that laid bare, I couldn't stop the question that echoed louder than any letter, any death certificate, any whispered admission. What if I'm more like him than I thought? What if the darkness that drove him to lie, to hide, to build a life on silence, what if it lives in me too? That question, more than anything, haunted me, and the only way to answer was to keep going, to find Samuel, to face the legacy we both inherited, and decide what to do with it. Because silence may be passed down, but so can truth. And if I didn't tell it, who would? It was a sound that led me there, a hollow, almost imperceptible echo beneath the floorboards of the attic, a subtle resonance I hadn't noticed in all my hours spent hunched over letters and photos and questions. But one night, while shifting the desk to reach a fallen pen, I heard it. The brief, muted thud with striking empty space instead of solid ground, and it stopped me cold, heart drumming, breath held, the kind of moment where instinct whispers louder than logic. And without thinking, I knelt and tapped again, fingers splayed across the aging boards until I found it. The section that felt lighter, thinner, wrong. The gap was small, no more than a foot across, barely visible beneath an old rug we'd never bothered to move. But once I peeled it back, the outline became clear. A square hatch recessed, almost seamless, as if it had been deliberately crafted to disappear. I should have gone for tools, gloves, something to prepare me, but I didn't. I slid my fingers into the narrow groove and pulled, wincing as it would creak in protest before finally giving way with a low groan that seemed to shudder through the beams of the house itself. The smell hit first, damp, earthy, a mix of mildew and something older, like books forgotten, in a flooded basement, and it made me gag, cover my mouth as I peered into the darkness below. A narrow ladder descended into the void, its rungs warped and discolored, and though my rational mind screamed for caution, I climbed down, one step at a time, heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my teeth. The room beneath the attic wasn't large, barely the size of a storage closet, but was unlike anything else in the house. Stone walls instead of wood, a dirt floor, and a single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. its cord trailing up to the hatch like a vein. I pulled the chain, and the light flickered to life, casting sickly yellow shadows across the space. It was a room built to be forgotten, to be buried above and below and never spoken of again. There were no shelves, no boxes, just a small table against the far wall and a chair beside it, both covered in dust thick enough to mute their outlines. On the table lay a single object, a binder, old and swollen with moisture, its leather cracked and warped. I opened it with shaking hands, coughing from the stirred-up dust, and inside found what felt like the heart of everything I'd been uncovering: transcripts, dozens of pages, each dated, each typewritten, with handwritten annotations in the margins, interviews, statements, letters never sent. There were police reports from 1964 regarding a missing girl near the edge of Marlow County. No name, no follow-up. There were pages of my grandfather's handwriting, not the elegant script of the attic letters, but hurried, angry scrawls filled with crossed-out lines and accusations, at himself, at someone named Walter, at fate itself. I tried to stop it, one note read, but Walter said she saw too much. He said we couldn't take the risk. I didn't know she was pregnant. God forgive me. I sat down hard in the dust, legs folding beneath me, lungs tight with a pressure I didn't recognize until I realized I was crying. Deep, racking sobs that echoed off the stone like wails in a crypt. Walter, the name I hadn't heard until now. Was he the accomplice? The real monster behind the acts my grandfather never fully confessed? Or was he another fractured part of the man I thought I knew, a pseudonym used to distance himself from what he'd done? I didn't know, and the truth began to blur again. My hands shook as I turned the pages, each one darker than the last. There was a page that simply read, "The child is the curse." Beneath it, he is a reminder that mercy has consequences. And beneath that, in smeared ink, he looks like me. I closed the binder, chest heaving, feeling the walls of the hidden room close in, the air too still, too old. I climbed back up the ladder, closing the hatch behind me with a quiet, final sound, and sat in the attic surrounded by my grandfather's letters, my own notes, the portrait, the map of truths and half-truths pinned to the walls, and I felt the line between the house and the past collapse completely. That room wasn't just physical. It was metaphor. It was memory made manifest. It was a space we all build inside ourselves to house what we can't face, and once open, it never really closes again. I knew then that I couldn't stop. Not until I knew everything. Not until I looked Samuel in the eyes, if he was still out there, and told him what no one else had dared to say, that his pain mattered, that his life was real, that the silence had been a choice and not a fate. But even as I told myself that, I knew the real confrontation wasn't with him. It was with myself, with the part of me that wanted to shut that hatch and pretend I'd never found it. Because some truths aren't just painful, they're transformative. They tear away the skin of the world and show you the bone beneath. And once you see it, you can never go back. The IT was tucked beneath the lining of the box, hidden so carefully I might never have found it if not for a moment of desperation. My hands digging through brittle cardboard like I was trying to claw through time itself, heart pounding, breath sharp. And there it was, an envelope different from the rest, heavier, sealed with wax, and scrawled across the front in my name. Not initials, not a coded reference, but my full name and my grandfather's. Unmistakable handwriting, the sight of which made my stomach twist into knots because it meant he'd known I would find the letters, known I would keep reading, known I would get this far and come undone, and still he had written this, had left it waiting like a final, loaded gun beneath all the wreckage, and for the first time since this began, I truly hesitated, hand trembling above the seal, afraid not of ghosts or violence or monsters, but the truth, personal, pointed, final, and when I broke it open, the air in the attic felt different, like something sacred had been disturbed, and I sat in the quiet with only the sound of my own pulse as I unfolded the letter and began to read. "You were never meant to carry this," it began, and already my throat closed with grief, with rage, with unbearable sadness, because I knew what was coming. Not the facts, not the history, but the weight, the awful, impossible weight of being the one left to bear witness. By the time you read this, I'll be long gone, and maybe that's the only reason you'll believe any of it. I never had the courage to say these things out loud. Not to your mother, not to you, not even to myself some days. But I need you to know I was a coward. I made choices that ruined lives. I buried truths because they were inconvenient, because they would destroy the life I built, and I told myself I was doing it to protect my family. But really, I was doing it to protect my own sanity. I let a child disappear. I let a woman die with my name still in her throat. And I went on living like that didn't change me. But it did. Every good thing I gave you, every moment of joy we shared, it came from a place that had been blackened, and you deserved better. I wept silently as I read, tears falling onto the paper, warping the ink as though my grief was being written into the letter itself. I saw you grow up with so much light, and every time I looked at you, I felt the shadow behind it. Not because of anything you did, but because of everything I never told you. There's something inside you, something I gave you without meaning to. It's the silence, the ability to pretend everything is fine when it's not, to keep secrets, to smile when it's killing you. And I'm begging you, don't let it live in you the way it lived in me. Break it, tear it out, tell the truth, even if it costs you, especially if it costs you. The letter went on, each line a deeper wound, each paragraph confession meant not to absolve but to explain. He wrote of Walter, finally naming him as a cousin, a man with a violent streak and a love for control, a man who had gone too far one night when alcohol and fear mixed in his blood, a man who had turned a disagreement into an irreversible act and begged my grandfather for help when the girl stopped breathing. I should have gone to the police, he wrote. I should have let the whole thing burn. But I didn't. I helped him hide her. I told myself we were protecting the family name, that we were doing it for your mother, for her future. But we weren't. We were protecting ourselves. And when she came back months later, stomach full and eyes hollow, I saw everything we buried come crawling back up through the ground. I wanted to help her. I swear I did, but I was too far gone. I couldn't bring myself to face the truth, and so I let her disappear again. I sent money in secret. I watched from afar, and when she died, I mourned like a stranger. I wanted to scream, to tear the letter in half, to climb back through time and grab him by the shoulders and make him do the right thing. But all I could do was read. If the boy is alive, and I believe he is, he has every right to hate me. He has every right to hate all of us. I hope you find him. I hope you tell him everything. But more than that, I hope you forgive yourself for what none of us could face. You're not me. You never were. You've already gone further than I ever did. The letter ended with one final sentence, scrawled across the bottom in handwriting, so jagged it looked almost like a child's. Make something good out of this, or let it die with me, but don't carry it forever. I sat with that letter for hours, unable to move, the attic dimming around me, the silence now filled with the echoes of every word he'd never said until it was too late. And I knew, in that hollow, grieving moment, that I was standing at the edge of something final. I could let this be the end, fold the letter, seal the box, walk away and never speak of it again. Or I could finish what he started, tell the truth, find the boy, face the bloodline, and maybe, just maybe, finally be freed. I didn't plan the gathering. It happened because it had to, because truth once released becomes a living thing, wild and insistent and impossible to cage again. And after reading the final letter, I knew I couldn't carry this alone another minute without it breaking something vital inside me. So I called them all, my mother, my brother, my uncle's widow, even distant cousins who still lived nearby. Told them there was something they needed to see, something they had the right to know. And when they arrived, one by one, stepping through the threshold of a house that had always felt safe and ordinary, they sensed a shift in the air, the heaviness, the unspoken tension vibrating in the walls like the echo of withheld screams. And I watched their expressions flicker from confusion to suspicion to dread as I laid out the letters, the photographs, the death certificate, the articles, the binder from the hidden room, and finally, the letter with my name on it, the one he had written just for me. And as they sat around a dining room table, the same table where birthdays had been celebrated and Thanksgiving pies passed with warm smiles, I began to read aloud, voice shaking but steady, and the room changed with every word, every sentence, another chisel strike against the wall of silence we'd all lived behind. And when I was done, The silence that followed was deeper than anything I'd ever felt. Not empty, but loaded, like the second, before an earthquake. And then my mother spoke, her voice raw and low. He told me she ran away, said she wanted nothing to do with us. And I could see in her eyes the unraveling of decades, the collapse of belief into realization, and she cried. Not just for him, or for the girl, or for the boy who might still be out there, but for herself, for every year she'd spent defending a version of the past built on omission. And then my brother stood up, face pale, eyes wet, and said, "So what does that make us? What does that make me?" And I didn't have an answer, none of US did, because there is no language for that kind of fracture, no script to follow when your family name becomes synonymous with betrayal. And still, they listened as I told them about Walter, about the cabin, about the room beneath the attic and the portrait in the shed, and every new revelation was a blow, but not fatal, just deep and lasting and necessary. And then my uncle's widow spoke for the first time, her voice tight. I always knew there was something off. He hated talking about his childhood. And her words broke something in the room, released a flood of half-remembered stories, quiet suspicions, family jokes that suddenly sounded like coded confessions. And we stayed like that for hours, unpacking the past like a house full of ticking clocks. Each story a key that opened another door we didn't know we had locked. And though there were no screams, no dramatic walkouts, the emotional violence was just as real, a grieving togetherness, a shattering unity forged not from forgiveness, not yet, but from mutual recognition that we had all been living in the echo of one man's silence. And when night fell and the house dimmed, no one rushed to leave, as if stepping outside would shatter the fragile honesty we'd finally reached. And I watched my mother walk into the living room and sit in his old chair, fingers brushing the armrest as though hoping for some final answer that would never come. And my brother stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes distant. And I realized that the truth, while corrosive, had also bound us differently, not by blood, but by burden, by the shared knowledge that we were now the keepers of a story too heavy for anyone else to hold alone. And as I looked around the room, at the wreckage and the reckoning, I felt something new. Not peace, not closure, but the faintest beginning of something honest, something painful and necessary and real. And I knew this was the only way forward. The days that followed the gathering passed like slow-moving fog, each hour heavy with the knowledge we could no longer return to lives we had before the letters were read. And though no one said aloud, we all knew we were standing on the edge of decision that would define us. What to do with the truth, now that it had been unearthed, ugly and complete and undeniable. Whether to keep it hidden again, bury it deeper with new shovels forged from guilt and fatigue. Or to let it breathe, to speak it into the world and bear whatever consequences it might bring. And though I had thought the hardest part would be the discovery, I quickly realized that the aftermath, the choosing, was far more painful, because this wasn't just about legacy or justice or moral clarity. It was about identity, about the fragile threads that tied us to the stories we've been told our whole lives. And unweaving those threads meant admitting that we had lived inside a lie, not because we were naive, but because we needed to believe in something better than the truth. We met again, my mother, my brother, my uncle's widow, 2 cousins from out of town. And this time the meeting felt colder, more procedural, as though we were all afraid of the emotions that might rise again if we let them. And I laid out the documents one last time. This time in the living room beneath the soft yellow light of the chandelier that had hung above every family holiday since I was a child. And I asked the question that had been haunting me since the moment I read the last line of the final letter. Do we keep this, or do we let it die with him? The silence that followed was different than before, not heavy with shock, but taut with fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing that whatever choice we made, it would haunt us in different ways. My mother was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. He asked me to burn them once, she said, her eyes fixed on a box of letters. I told him I couldn't. I was too afraid to forget. Her words struck me as both profound and tragic, because remembering and forgetting had become a moral tug-of-war none of us were prepared for. And though I saw the pain in her expression, I also saw something else, a quiet strength, a decision forming beneath the tremble in her voice. My brother, ever pragmatic, argued that nothing good would come from sharing it publicly, that it would ruin what little peace we had left, that we were only punishing ourselves by continuing to dig. And while I understood his logic, I also knew he hadn't read the letters the way I had hadn't felt their weight in the silence of the attic, hadn't heard our grandfather's voice breaking through each page with the desperation of a man trying to undo the gravity of his sins. My uncle's widow surprised us all. She said we owed it to the boy, to Samuel, to tell him, no matter what it cost, even if he hated us for it, even if he never spoke to us again, because at least then someone had honored the truth of his existence. Someone had said, "You were not forgotten." That argument struck a chord in me, and I found myself nodding, heart-hammering with the realization that I agreed, not because I wanted redemption, but because silence, once inherited, becomes a curse that mutates with every generation, and if we didn't end it now, then we were just passing the rot forward. The decision, when it finally came, was not unanimous, but it was clear. We would preserve the letters, document everything, create a private archive, a digital vault that could be shared when needed, and I would be the one to write the full account, not as a novel, not as a dramatization, but as a record, a ledger of what was, who we were, what we did with what we were given. We agreed to burn the original copies, not out of shame, but as a symbolic act. Ashes returned to the earth, carrying with them the weight of secrets no longer hidden. That night, we gathered in the backyard, the same space where we had once roasted marshmallows and watched fireworks, and one by one, I fed the letters into the fire, watching the pages curl and blacken, ink disappearing into flame, and though I expected to feel lighter, what I felt instead was a deeper gravity, a responsibility that settled into my bones. My mother placed a final envelope, my letter, into the flames, tears in her eyes, and said, "He didn't ask for forgiveness, but maybe this is how we give it." We watched until the fire died, until the ashes settled, until the night air grew cold and silent once more. And though the story was not yet over, something in that moment felt complete, like a door had closed behind us, not with finality, but with resolution. We returned inside, each of us changed, each of us carrying the names of those who have been erased, each of us learning, slowly, how to speak without fear, how to live without silence. The house is quieter now, not in the way it was before, empty and deceptive, but quieter in a manner that feels deliberate, like a breath held just long enough to acknowledge the weight of everything that's been said and burned and buried again, not in shame this time, but in remembrance. And as I move through its rooms, now stripped of illusion, I feel something I never expected to. Stillness. Not peace, not healing, not yet, but the beginning of something like clarity, the steady realization that though truth doesn't set you free in the way stories promise, it does carve a space where freedom might eventually live. And in the weeks since the fire, I've found myself thinking less about what we destroyed and more about what we finally named. Because naming something, truly naming it, gives it shape, gives it form. And that form can be understood, even if it can't be forgiven. I've begun writing again, but not the obsessive notes or frantic timelines or desperate hypotheses that once consumed me. Now I write letters, dozens of them, not to anyone in particular, just to the silence, to the space between what was done and what was said, and in each one, I try to trace the edges of what it means to carry a bloodline that didn't begin with me and won't end with me, a legacy not of glory or strength, but of secrecy and pain, and the terrible things people do in the name of love or fear or family. I've taken the archive, the digital vault we created, and begun shaping it into something usable, something ethical, a testimony bound in context, not spectacle, because the last thing I want is to sensationalize what happened, to reduce real lives into narrative twists, and maybe that's the part of me that has changed the most, not the part that uncovered the truth, but the part that now knows what to do with it. I've reached out to organizations that help reconnect people with lost relatives, using what little information we had left. Samuel's likely age, his mother's name, a list of possible foster agencies from Ohio in the 1980s. And though I haven't found him yet, I've written the letter 100 times in my head, rehearsed the moment when I might tell him everything, not to ask for anything, not even forgiveness, but simply to say, "You were real. We know. We remember." I don't know if I'll ever send it. I don't know if I'll ever find him. But the act of searching feels sacred now, like tending a grave for someone who was never buried properly. My mother has softened in small, invisible ways. She talks about her father now, not with nostalgia, but with complexity, sometimes staring out the window for long stretches before speaking, as if still piecing together the man from the fragments he left behind. And my brother, though distant, calls more often, always starting with silence before asking how I am. And that's become our way of saying we're still here, still bearing it. I visit the attic less frequently now, not because I fear it, but because I no longer need it the way I did. Its secrets have been exhumed, its silence broken, and when I do return, I go not to find answers, but to remember the feeling of standing at the edge of a truth that nearly swallowed me whole. Sometimes I think about the child I might have one day, if I ever choose to build a family of my own, and I wonder what I'll tell them, how I'll explain that they come from a line not of heroes or legends, but flawed people who made impossible choices and suffered the consequences in silence. And I think the answer is this: I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them the truth, not to burden them, but to give them a choice I was never offered, to carry it differently, to speak it out loud, to write their own names without fear of what shadows lie beneath. Because the bloodline we carry isn't just ours by inheritance. It's ours by reckoning, by what we choose to do with the broken pieces passed down like rusted heirlooms. And if there's any redemption in this story, it's that we finally stop pretending those pieces weren't sharp. I walk through this house now with open eyes, knowing the walls have heard everything, and I let them keep those echoes, not as hauntings, but as reminders of who we were, of what we did, and of the silence we finally ended.